Hello. In today's lesson for greenhouse environment, we're going to talk about moisture in the air and water potential. So this is a probably one of the more important lessons, I would say, as far as managing crop growth, keeping it on schedule, and managing disease. So there'll be some review of some of your Plant Science 1 stuff, some of the stuff I've talked about in the greenhouse during our labs, but let's bring some of this together. And you will talk a little bit about this in the winter again with Matt in your greenhouse controls. Very important topic. So let's dig in. So I want to cover. This is where we get some review. Water inside the plant, specifically in leaves and roots. And then we're going to talk about water outside the plant. And that's where things like humidity are really important. So let's review some of the things that water does. It carries nutrients through the root zone, right? All the way up into the plant. So it's a way of transporting nutrients. Sometimes we forget the basics like that. Carries nutrients through the cell wall, so maybe even into the root, through the root zone. Carries nutrients through the vascular bundles and provides pressure to keep your plant from wilting. So that's where osmosis comes in. And it also, a very small percent, like 1% or less, provides the hydrogen and oxygen required for photosynthesis to happen. So some of the water is consumed, but the vast majority just goes in the roots and evaporates. But it creates a lot of motive energy in the plant in the process. And also important and often neglected is it cools the plant through evaporation. We'll touch on that a little bit today as well. So what is water potential? It is energy, right? We're talking about gravity or osmotic or vapor. Different forms have different pressure potentials. And that is how it drives movement of water through plants, is with that energy. So just like a waterfall has high energy at the top and lower energy at the bottom, which creates motive force to drive the water down. That's pretty obvious, but it's exactly the same thing. In that case, it's gravitational potential energy. In plants, you don't really see a lot of gravitational potential energy. I think in plant science too, I hope you discussed a little bit about how water gets to the top of giant trees and how it has to overcome the weight of the water, which is overcoming gravitational potential energy, which is a fascinating topic. So let's look at physical potential energy. In the very simplest form, if you look at a water pump, it sucks water in, spins it up, and pushes it up against gravity, creating potential energy. In a waterfall, again, that potential energy is relieved when the water is allowed to run back down, right? So that is physical potential energy. And we can also generate physical potential energy, which also translates into gravitational potential energy with osmosis. So in the sense that a plant has sugars on one side of a membrane, and say in the root zone outside the environment, water moves towards the sugars, creating osmotic energy, which then inflates cells. Or we call that turgor pressure, where the water now, because water has moved in, creating pressure, it pushes on the cell walls and keeps the plant from wilting, in this case, right? So water moves in because there's sugars and exerts pressure on the cell walls, and that pushes on the plant to keep it pumped up with turgor pressure, essentially. So that is one of the more basic forms of water potential, and that is turgor pressure, right? So osmotic potential causing water to move in. Now, what is interesting to note about turgor pressure is that when you have sugars or solutes, they reduce the water potential inside the cell, which means that suddenly the water outside the cell has more potential, and water moves from low to high, so it moves into the cell where there's low water potential, right? So water moves from high to low, just like a waterfall. But in this case, it's going to move from outside into the lower water potential cells because the sugars have created a reduced water potential. That difference is what drives it. And as far as actual pressures that are exerted, up to 210 psi on the cell walls, which is pretty fantastic. That's a lot of pressure. So again, just another picture. We go from high water potential to low water potential. So when you have sugars dissolved in the cells, it creates a low water potential. Oh, that's hard to write. And draws water in. Okay? One more time. High solutes on this side means water moves in because it has lower water potential relative to no solutes on this side. So the water flows through the membrane in. You may remember from Plant Science 2 when I talked a little bit about water potential, my example of the cherry tomatoes where your tomatoes are getting ripe and they have lots of sugar, creating a really low water potential zone. And when that happens, water can rush from the plant through the petiole into the fruit, causing it to swell. Remember, up to 210 psi pressure is a lot. This is where some varieties that are grown by farmers end up having thicker skin to reduce the risk of fruit being spoiled from splitting. And some of you, myself included, have sampled the cherry tomatoes at the college, and you may notice that they are much meatier with a thicker skin than the million bells or whatever it is, sweet cherries that you might get at the garden center. And one of the reasons being is that they're bred to minimize fruit splitting to reduce spoilage. How can we reduce this from happening? Hopefully you remember from Plant Science 2, if you're growing cherry tomatoes in a pot, which is your worst case scenario, or hydroponically, you do not want to add just straight water to the soil when the fruit is approaching ripe, fully ripe state. Because if you have clear water, it has very high water potential relative to the low water potential in the fruit. So what I'm trying to say is if you add a little fertilizer to your watering can, you won't split the fruit because fertilizer reduces the water potential in the watering can. So the difference in water potential between what you're adding to the root and what's in the fruit is less extreme, and so your fruit won't split. Now in hydroponics, we're usually running fairly high ECs in the water anyway, so it's less of a risk. But there is a chance that something happens and there's no nutrients, the ECs start to get really low, and then you can burst your fruits. So water potential from an irrigation perspective is important. Now, talking about climate, let's talk about moisture and water vapor in the climate. This is probably the crux of today's lesson. Water can move from liquid to vapor. We've all seen it. You have a kettle, you plug it in, it starts to steam. What is happening here is we have a combination of temperature and pressure. Now, pressure is not really that important unless you're boiling water at the top of a mountain or at the bottom of the ocean. But for our purposes with crop growing, we'll focus on the temperature side of things because that has the biggest impact on water vapor and its state. So if you're looking at a pot that's warming up, you'll see that water starts to come off the surface as vapor, steam. And if you close the top, as in have a sealed lid, the pressure builds, or at least the water vapor starts to accumulate. It's not escaping anymore. And eventually it reaches what we call equilibrium. That's essentially what we mean by saturated. So I'm just highlighting the words on the slides rather than reading everything. You can go over this in your PowerPoint as well. But what we're trying to talk about here is water reaching a saturated state. So if this air is continually allowed to escape, right, then saturation may not be achieved. Whereas if it's closed, it might. And again, we're talking about greenhouses. So think of it as greenhouse vents closed and greenhouse vents open, so air can escape. So Saturation can happen when your vents are closed, all right, versus venting it out. Not a lot of room here to draw. Sorry about that. But I think you get the idea. So condensation is something that happens when you've reached saturation and the air can no longer hold the moisture that is being presented to it. So in that case, condensation starts happening on any kind of cold surface because it has a lower temperature, so it can't hold as much water vapor, and it condenses. Um, this is where I'll introduce relative humidity. You've all heard it before in the weather forecast. You know, when it's a really humid day in the summer, we feel a lot hotter. Uh, so what is relative humidity? It gives us a measure, right? That's what it says here, a picture of how much moisture is currently in the air. So it's expressed as a percentage. You see that here. Um, and it's always relative to 100% saturation. That's why we have the term relative humidity. So relative to absolute saturation, we are at what percentage on our way, right? So relative to temperature. This is an interesting graph. The red line represents 100% humidity at any particular point in time based on temperature changing. So obviously, as the temperature increases, we can hold more water. So our 100% relative humidity goes higher, right? So this on the left here is grams of water per kilogram of air. So as we get warmer, we can physically hold more grams of water in a unit of air, right? So, and it's exponential. So as the temperature drops, let's say we reverse the flow and the temperature drops, the air can hold less moisture and it drops fairly quickly. So this is important when it comes to managing a suitable climate in a greenhouse because we need to be careful that we monitor our humidity for reasons of plant growth and disease prevention. So how do we measure it? I think Matt talked to some of you in your crops class about the wet bulb thermometers that are in the greenhouse. Again, you'll cover this in your greenhouse controls class in the winter, but essentially there's a box hanging in the different zones in the greenhouse, and it has two thermometers in it. A normal one, which we call a dry bulb thermometer, and one that has the bottom of the bulb attached to a wick that is wet with a little reservoir of water. And that wet wick actually evaporates. And as it evaporates, it cools the thermometer. So we end up with a difference or a delta between the two thermometers. And that goes into an algorithm to give us our percent relative humidity. Obviously, the drier the air, the more rapidly this evaporates, the cooler this becomes. So as we approach 100% humidity, what happens? What would you expect? If we're approaching 100% humidity, what would happen with this wick? It will evaporate less, which means the delta becomes smaller. Effectively, I'll just draw a red line in here. If we had a really humid environment, this thermometer would be almost identical. And if it is 100%, it will be absolutely identical to the dry thermometer because there's no evaporation happening off the wick, so there's no cooling. So it's this differential that allows the computer to calculate relative humidity. And we call that a wet bulb thermometer. There's actually handheld spinning ones. This is a hand grip here. And you dip this wick in some water and then you spin it around like a party clapper thing. And as it spins through the air, this evaporates and then you stop it and you look at your two thermometers. This one's your dry and this is your wet. And you look at the difference and you plot it on a graph and it tells you your relative humidity. This is a greenhouse box similar to the ones we have in the college, and there's a water reservoir and there's a wick that goes up to a thermometer, and that's where the evaporative cooling happens. And just out of curiosity, just our interest, I should say, on the top here, that's right here, is infrared picture of a plant. I think it's a Arabidopsis. And it's showing that the leaves are quite a bit cooler than the rest of the soil and the surrounding area. And that is specifically because of evaporation. That's an important thing to remember, that when plants are actually evaporating moisture, when they're transpiring, they cool their leaves. And that's really, really important in when you have heat stress on crops. So it's important to make sure you don't have too high humidity so that the plants can actually transpire for many reasons, but one of them is to reduce stress. And if you remember your plant science too, by keeping the leaves cool through evapotranspiration, they reduce or limit photorespiration, which is going to hurt our plant's ability to make sugars. So, all right, so we have 100% relativity in this graph. That's just a reminder, this line. And as you move up and down the temperature range, it changes how much moisture the air can hold, right? So at 10 degrees Celsius, it can hold 10 grams. And at 50 degrees Celsius, it can hold 95 grams of water. So it's a pretty huge difference in water content at different temperatures. So what's the take home? Let's say 70% relative humidity is an acceptable humidity for your crop, right? Suddenly, 100% is achieved because your air's water holding capacity is changed. And what would that scenario be? Let's say at the end of the day, right? The sun is going down and your greenhouse is cooling, right? The temperature is dropping in your greenhouse because the sun's going down. The exact same moisture content, which had a nice, happy 70% relative humidity. Remember that graph, as the temperature drops, it can't hold the moisture anymore and it quickly reaches 100%. And if you're really unfortunate, it actually starts to surpass that, which means you get condensation because the air can no longer hold the moisture. That's how rain happens. You've got a cloud, and as the temperature drops, say the cloud moves to a higher altitude, the air condenses out because the air can't hold the moisture condenses out, and it forms water droplets which fall in the form of rain. And in the greenhouse, as the temperature drops and the air can't hold the moisture, it forms water droplets as in the form of condensation on your structure, or worse yet, on your leaves, which then creates the moisture for spores to germinate for things like powdery mildew. So what do we do for powdery mildew? We need to remove the moisture at the end of the day. So for growing crops that are prone to powdery mildew, this is standard growing practice where towards the end of the day you open the vents, but that may not be just enough. Oftentimes there's a process. I call it heat and burp, but effectively what you do is you release some heat into the greenhouse, so whether it's hot water in your pipes or turning a furnace on for a short time, raises the temperature. Remember, as air is warmer, it can hold more moisture. So it gathers more moisture out of the greenhouse because you've just injected energy with heat, and then you open the vents. And the combination of warm air rising and its higher capacity for moisture means that that warm, moist air then quickly exits the vents, and you've just effectively dried your greenhouse. And then you close the vents and you button up for the night, and the crop goes to sleep for the night. And you don't have powdery mildew germinating on your crop. This is a process I've been trying to help some growers learn for things like cannabis, where powdery mildew is a constant problem. That heat and burp strategy is absolutely critical for minimizing powdery mildew on a crop. Okay, so let's go back to talking about potential energy. I talked about gravitational potential energy. I talked about physical potential energy in terms of water pressure. And then I linked it to osmotic potential energy, which is basically what drives the physical pressure in plants. But we also have potential energy in water vapor. And this is an introduction to what we call vapor pressure deficit, which is another interesting way of looking at moisture in the air of a greenhouse. And as you get into growing, you'll see that VPD, or vapor pressure deficit, is used quite a bit. Oh, my phone. Yeehaw. So what exactly is it? So as air dries, it reduces its water potential energy, or vapor potential energy. So remember, with potential energy, that diagram where you have water goes from high to low, just like a waterfall. It goes from high gravitational to low gravitational, or from high osmotic potential to low osmotic potential. So it goes from clear water to sugar water. With water vapor, it goes from high water vapor to low water vapor pressure. So high water potential, vapor potential energy to low water vapor potential energy. So that downward hill flow is important to understand. And when we're talking about VPD, we're talking about the difference between the plant and its environment. So again, it goes from high to low. And this is a cross section of a leaf. And you can imagine inside the leaf is the spongy mesophyll, right? This is where all the photosynthesis is happening. This is where the magic happens, where sugars are made. This is the factory. And you have a lot of water being supplied by the xylem, bringing water to these cells, and they eventually evaporate it into the spongy mesophyll space, sometimes called the interstitial space. These air spaces between the mesophyll accumulate high moisture content or high water vapor potential. And the plant, much like a greenhouse, tries to vent that off, just like we would heat and burp a greenhouse to reduce the moisture. What the leaf does, its vents are stomata, right? So the stomata open, creating a pore, which releases that vapor potential energy into the surrounding environment. So inside a leaf, we have the spongy mesophyll. You see these spaces that become very saturated with water vapor, and that water vapor escapes through stomata into the environment, just like a greenhouse vents water vapor out its vents. It's really helpful if you think of a leaf as a greenhouse, because that sort of makes sense to us, you know, our concept of venting it out. How we assess how water will move from inside a leaf to outside is by looking at water vapor or vapor pressure deficit. From a growing perspective, it's really important you manage a suitable VPD, because if you don't have enough of a deficit, the deficit being low VPD outside versus high VPD inside. If your greenhouse is too humid, air won't flow out, and if you don't have evaporation happening in the mesophyll, then water can't flow in because it's not evaporating, so it's saturated, and the entire plant shuts down, and you don't have any growth. So having high humidity or high vapor potential energy in your greenhouse will actually physically slow the movement of water through the plants, which slows the movement of sugars, shuts down everything, every physical process in the plant. So it just stalls. I've seen this mistake with farms where they're trying to save energy in the winter by not venting warm air out because they don't want to lose the heat that they just paid to heat. But unfortunately, the humidity just builds and builds and builds in the greenhouse until there is absolutely no vapor pressure deficit and no water leaving the leaves of the plant, which means it stalls and nothing grows. So as the outside air is drier, we get a larger deficit, which means moisture inside wants to exit, and you get more transpiration. So it's important to understand that we need VPD, vapor pressure deficit, in order to get transpiration to happen. Okay, that's the key. One of the challenges we have in measuring vapor pressure deficit is that we can't easily, there are maybe some scientific devices, but in farms we don't have the ability to measure the humidity inside the mesophyll of a leaf. That's very tricky. But what we can do is we can measure the vapor pressure deficit of the environment relative to saturated air. And so that VPD is calculated and estimated for what is happening in the leaf. So most computer systems have output charts. This is a chart from Argus, and these are VPD values that are in the entire chart. And you'll notice that there's it's a bit faded, but there's sort of a pink, yellow, and green, and then yellow and pink in terms of the different zones of the chart. And hopefully it's intuitive, but the green zone is where the plants are happiest. That's where optimal transpiration is happening. And outside that zone is the danger zone. Either too much vapor pressure deficit or too little. I hadn't touched on this yet, but if you have really, really, really high water stress, the plants will panic and close their stomata because they don't want to lose more water than they can supply with their roots, because that will start causing physical damage. So there's such a thing as being too dry and such a thing as being too humid. Um, if you're looking at the graph, you will notice that it's fairly broad. Um, and you'll also notice that it uses relative humidity and temperature to calculate the VPD. And so our wet bulb sensor gives us our current relative humidity. And then with the temperature that's measured with a thermometer, the VPD is calculated and estimated for the leaf. I have had farms that struggle with powdery mildew because they don't understand VPD, and they don't use relative humidity. They just use, they don't use VPD, they just use relative humidity. And one of the troubles here, let me back that up. They use VPD, but they don't use relative humidity. The main reason is because, let's say you on your computer system say, look, I'm going to set my VPD to be 0.9. And the computer will open and close the vents and modulate the greenhouse to manage a 0.9 VPD. All right. Now, as the temperature fluctuates during the day, it's not hard to see how your greenhouse would be 22 degrees during the day, and you might float it down to 16 at night, right? That's sort of your day-night temperature. Look at what happens to your 0.92. So here's a point, this is pretty close, 0.93, 0.93, 0.91, 0.94. Now, the computer's managing your VPD within the specification that you assigned, but there's a problem. Look at the relative humidity. To maintain a VPD of 0.9 at 16 degrees Celsius, we're going down to 45% relative humidity. And if you remember some of my chats with you and maybe in your pathology with respect to powdery mildew does two things. Above 75% relative humidity, the spores will germinate and grow hyphae. Below 50% relative humidity, powdery mildew will sporulate and produce more spores. So if you're fluctuating between high and low humidity, not only are you growing your powdery mildew, but then you're encouraging it to form spores so that it spreads even more, and you have a bigger and bigger problem all the time. So it's these wild fluctuations that we have to be very careful with. And one of the reasons why you can't use VPD alone, you have to monitor relative humidity as well to make sure you're not going into a danger zone. So keep that in mind. That might solve you some headaches with powdery mildew. So maintaining a suitable VPD, vapor pressure deficit, whoops, I'm trying to erase that, will keep water moving through your plant. If we don't have enough deficit, the water stops and the plant stops growing. And likewise, the other direction, if we have too extreme a vapor pressure deficit, the plant will shut down its stomata in a self-preservation mode, and you also stop. And usually the plants overheat at that point because there's no evapotranspiration to cool the leaves. So you get heat stress, you get root collapse, a lot of bad things happen physiologically. Let's talk briefly about condensation. Condensation is not necessarily a bad thing. It removes moisture from the air. We talked about this when we talked about shade, but condensation can also cause problems in terms of water in the ground, which encourages algae and maybe shore flies and fungus gnats. It can drip from your covering onto seedlings and wash out seedlings. There's all sorts of challenges associated with condensation, but when we use curtains, we can use them to manage humidity. So I like to think of energy curtains as a tool for managing vapor pressure deficit. So for example, you could, if you're heating a greenhouse, you can steer the vapor pressure deficit by opening and closing the curtains, depending on the light levels, time of day, and stuff like that. But just like when I talked about curtains, by opening the curtains in the morning, we let that humid air come up, hit the greenhouse glass, condense, collect that condensation. That's gone. It's out of the air, and you have what we call an active environment where the plants wake up and start to transpire as the sun comes up. So energy curtains are a tool you can use in monitoring and managing vapor pressure deficit. I want to talk a little bit about the boundary layer. I mentioned this once before, but let's talk again about it. Airflow is super critical, especially when we're talking about humidity, because we don't often see what it is where the actual high humidity is. When we look at the greenhouse, you walk in, you experience the environment. For sure, that is absolutely something that you can perceive. But when you look at the microscopic level of a plant, there is actually a layer close to the surface where the gases are sort of stuck to the leaf. We call that a boundary layer. And you can have high humidity in that boundary layer, which will impact water moving out through the stomata. So we need to be able to get rid of that or influence that boundary layer to encourage water to flow out of the leaves. On this picture up here, you see all the trichomes that are sticking up off the leaf. And just like in a forest, they create an environment where air flows over the leaf, right? And it may not actually flow into and between the trichomes as effectively. So you get localized high humidity. So some crops that have a lot more trichomes are more susceptible to that and require more airflow across the leaf surface to influence the boundary layer. Just like a field of corn, this is just showing how the wind is blowing over the corn and the wind blows across, but in between the stalks, you have a different environment, much more humid. Again, influencing things like calcium movement through the tissues because they rely heavily on transpiration. If you grow too densely and there's not enough airflow between the plants, you can have calcium deficiencies in the lower parts of the plants. So spacing when you seed the crop is important for airflow. So if you get too greedy and you plant too many plants in a fixed space, you don't get enough airflow between the tissues and the leaves, and you end up with calcium deficiencies because you have inadequate transpiration. All right, that's enough. Hopefully you followed that. Humidity is an important topic. Vapor pressure deficit is an important topic. Matt will cover this one more time in the winter term with your greenhouse computer or controls class. Make sure you understand humidity. On just business notes, remind you all that there are quizzes being added every week now for all 3 of my classes. So keep an eye on that. And those will remain open till the end of the term, but don't wait. I would just do them while you can. All right. Talk to you later.